A very good afternoon from Singapore, and welcome to this online panel hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. My name is Clemens Che, and I will serve as host and moderator for today's virtual event titled Iran's New Presidency, Shifting Tides or Status Quo. We are pleased to welcome three experts to discuss the political scene in Tehran and its implications for succession, domestic politics, and foreign policy. A very good morning to our guest speakers, Professor Mihran Kamrava, Dr. Luciano Zakara, and Dr. Zakiye Yazdashinas, who are joining us from Doha and Tehran, respectively. Before we dive into the discussion, please allow me to lay down some house rules and to explain the proceedings. Each speaker will be given 10 to 12 minutes to deliver their remarks before we head into the Q&A segment. I will briefly introduce the speaker's profile before each of them gives their respective comments. For the Q&A, should the audience have burning questions, you are invited to type your questions into the Zoom chat box and send them to MEI Events. Let me now say a few words about the topic that our esteemed panelists will be addressing very shortly. With the death of Iran's last president, Ibrahim Raisi, along with his foreign minister, in a helicopter crash earlier in May, there was fresh uncertainty injected into Tehran's clerical establishment. Across late June and early July, Iranians went to the polls to elect a new president, and Masoud Pezeshkian, a reformist and cardiac surgeon, pulled off a stunning victory in the process, besting hardliner Saeed Jalili. Today's discussion is certainly timely because just yesterday, the Iranian parliament approved all 19 ministers nominated by the freshly minted President Pezeshkian. The first time in more than 2 decades that parliamentary approval was obtained for the entire cabinet. These feat, bearing in mind that the new cabinet has both conservative and reformist elements, is cross-factional insofar as it reflects consensus. Former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, who was heavily involved in Pezeshkian's presidential campaign, later resigned before the parliamentary approval as vice president over cabinet selections. As such, do the cabinet appointments reflect or translate into pandering to the lowest common denominator? This is something that we will have to ask our guest speakers. Let me now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Luciano Zakara, who is a research associate professor at Qatar's University's Gulf Studies Center. He's also the director of the Observatory on Politics and Elections in the Arab and Muslim world in Spain, and he serves as a visiting assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar. His expertise, apart from Iranian and Gulf politics, also extends into the electoral systems of the Middle East and North Africa. This is something that we would like to pick his brains on for today. Luciano will take us through the indicators of the presidential elections, highlights of the campaigning process, and the lines between conservatives and reformists. So over to you, Luciano.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Clemens, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to share this table with my two colleagues. Let me share a short PowerPoint that I prepared just for a few slides to guide some of the things I want to say. First of all, that following the research I have been doing about electoral processes in Iran and in the region, I mean, we always have to explain why elections are important to be analyzed, to be followed. Moreover, considering that from the West, sometimes the way they approach elections in the Middle East, but Iran especially, is with a lot of not very well considered, and not even consider real elections. But elections in Iran have always, or at least since 1997, has always been a very interesting event to follow up because of the surprises that we have been witnessing since the victory of Khatami in 1997, the victory of Ahmadinejad in 2005, the victory of Rouhani in 2013, and this one, victory of Pezeshkian, that most of the scholars specialized were not aware that this could happen. Of course, there were some indications that this may happen, and of course, after the first round, the chances were much higher. But once the electoral process started after the death of Raisi, nobody really was thinking in the reformists coming back to the political scene. And of course, nobody was thinking in reformists winning a presidential election after very few years after they lost all the positions most of the positions in the parliament and the presidency. So first of all, functions of elections in Iran, for me, as it was demonstrated also in this election with the lack of unity within the conservative camp, is that the election serves in Iran to highlight and to solve intra-elect disputes, not only between conservative and reformists, but also within the conservative camp or even within the reformist camps when there are disputes. Also, these elections allowed the governments to periodically check on people's orientation. I mean, these are very good indicators of what is going on in Iran, what has been wrong, why reformists couldn't convince more people in previous elections, and why conservatives were not able to convince people only after 3 years of Raisi's victory. And also, elections are important because at the end of the day, they bring elected candidates into office. So elections have an impact. Elections at the end of the day define who is the president, who are the members of the parliament, regardless of course, despite the fact that there are many limitations and constraints, and sometimes the Guardian Council is using their veto power much more stronger than any other time. And particularly the role of presidential election is to form government within the framework of the Islamic Republic, of course, and to implement the foreign policies strategies based on the Islamic Republic principle. And this is, I think, the most important thing, at least from the Western point of view, why everybody's looking at what is going on when there are elections in Iran, because the president more or less defined the foreign policy strategy, the diplomatic style, etc., etc. You will agree with me that it's not the same what happened with Rouhani, with Ahmadinejad, or Khatami when they were presidents, despite the fact that at the end of the day, we can make a conclusion that not many changes happened inside Iran. But in the external, in the external front, of course, there were changes. This is just to discuss very few data about what happened during elections. Of course, these are all based on official data. I always clarify that. I don't work with alternative data. These elections serve to prove that this hypothesis that high participation was always benefiting reformists and low participation was always benefiting conservative is not right anymore. I mean, in these 2 rounds of election with 40 and 49% of participation, the lowest in the all presidential elections since 1980, a very low participation favor reformist candidate in the first and in the second round. It's not the first time that there are 2 rounds, but in the first round, in the first time that there was 2 rounds in 2005, Ahmadinejad won in the second round, not in the first one. In the first one, Rafsanjani was the candidate who won, and then only in the second round, Ahmadinejad defeated with the transfer of votes from other conservative voters towards Ahmadinejad. But more importantly, if you analyze the data broken down in provinces and districts, with the transfer of votes from reformists that they had voted for Karoubi, for instance, or Moin, towards Ahmadinejad. This favored Ahmadinejad's victory in the second round of 2009, even though in the first round he had only passed with less than 17% of the votes. So the important data to compare here is while Rafsanjani won in the first round in 2005 with 21%, and Ahmadinejad was the second front runner with 17%, the battle was between these two, and only in that occasion Ahmadinejad was able to get 61% of the vote, but only in the second round. If we compare what happened in this election, Masoud Pezeshkian won in the 2 rounds. In the first round, he didn't reach the limit, which is 50% necessary to avoid the second round, but it was clear that he had the biggest chances to win, unless there was a transfer of votes from Galibaf to Jalili, and other conservatives were able to vote also in the second round. Even though the participation rate increased from the first to the second round, 10%, the unity between conservatives did not happen. So that way, Masoud Pezeshkian was able to win with 54% of the vote. So, and this was, of course, against most of the predictions that, first of all, following what happened in 2021, when no reformist was allowed to participate, nobody expected that one candidate would be allowed by the Guardian Council. And second, nobody expected that at the end of the day, with the low participation, a candidate like Pezeshkian had win in the first round and in the second round. What is interesting to compare here, I mean, there are a lot of maps made by several researchers, some of them very well known, like Bernard Urquhart, always analyze the distribution, territorial distribution of votes. And it's interesting to point out that how at least these maps more or less reproduce what happened in the previous elections in which reformists won, mainly 1997 and 2001, when Khatami won, in which we see that there is a majority of support towards Pezeshkian in both rounds, in the first and the second round, in the peripheral areas, while in the central areas, the support is more towards Jalili in this case. Of course, Pezeshkian is from Mahabad in West Azerbaijan, so the three provinces of the north, West and East Azerbaijan, they supported overwhelmingly Pezeshkian. Is where he got the biggest percentage of votes compared with Jalili in both routes. Also in the south, Sistan Baluchistan, he obtained votes. I cannot see Tehran here, but I think in Tehran also Pezeshkian won. Pezeshkian and Tehran, the district of Tehran, Rey and Islam Shahar is the biggest district in Iran, and it's always the most important one to win in terms of absolute votes, because it can produce a change at the national level. And what I was saying before, I mean, when we compare what happened in the last 20 years or 30 years since 1997, is that it's not the same having Mohammad Khatami winning surprisingly for some at the elections in 1997, also Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Hassan Rouhani. The only one that there was a surprise, it was Ibrahim Raisi. Of course, there was no other competitor that could have challenged his victory. But the fact that the four presidents had different approach to internal politics and foreign policy made their tenures relevant for some of the reasons. I mean, for instance, Khatami, with cooperations of power strategy, managed to promote Iranian values, to open Iran to the world, to suggest to the United Nations General Assembly the dialogue of civilizations. So even though, again, he was not able to maintain the changes that he promised internally, but he left a legacy both internally and externally in Iran. Of course, the neoconservative Mahmoud Ahmadinejad changed totally the diplomatic style with anti-systemic foreign policy strategy that managed to make for the first time the United Nations Security Council to started to sanction Iran in 2006. So this is the beginning of the sanctions of the international community against Iran because of the nuclear issue. And since then, the Iranian foreign ministers and the diplomatic community had to deal with this file, mainly Hassan Rouhani, who managed to achieve the JCPOA. We can claim that it was not very effective at the end of the day, but the fact that it was his first objective, he managed in the first round to in her first attempt to do that. We cannot say too much about Ibrahim Raisi, and I don't want to talk about that as well, because his term was so short that his foreign policy was not very different from the previous administration to have a specific doctrine in foreign policy. I claim that he benefited from the trends that other presidents initiated. And to finish, I don't know if I'm running out of time. Who is Pezeshkian? Who is this president that supposedly he won surprisingly? Of course, he's not an unknown politician. He's from, as I said, from West Azerbaijan. He's a cardiac surgeon as a training medical doctor. And because of that, he was the health minister of Khatami between 2001 and 2005. He has been in politics since a long time ago, meaning that he's not a newcomer, and he's not an outliner either. So he was part of the reformist, the core of the reformist government of Khatami, and he was member, or has been member of the parliament since 2008 until now, and he was a deputy speaker between 2016 2020, when the reformists controlled the parliament, which of course is a very important position considering how the disputes within the factions work in Iran. So meaning that even though he was not very well known for outsiders, for people outside Iran, he was a known politician inside, and that shows that to what extent the fact that he was running as a candidate did not leave the people uninterested in elections. Even though, of course, the participation was very, very, very low compared with the previous one, he was able to attract at least a part of the reformist voters that they participated or that they voted Rouhani and Khatami in the previous electoral process. Maybe he failed to attract the youth that he wanted to attract in the first round, but the 10% increase between the first and the second shows that more people got enthusiastic about having again another president that was not from the conservative camp. Whether this means that still it's possible to produce change within the system without changing everything, considering that both Khatami and Rouhani were not able to guarantee that their changes remain, or that they were able to fulfill all the promises that they made during the campaign. This is something we will say as you introduce, and I assume that my other colleagues will talk about. This is a mixed cabinet that was approved yesterday with Arakchi as foreign minister. It was clear that he was the chosen one. This means that he will try to continue a dialogue with the West strategy. Some people suggest that health diplomacy could be one of the areas in which Pezeshkian, considering that he's a doctor, can work with. And I think the Minister of Health is also has been deputy minister and has different positions before during the times of Rouhani as well. So maybe this can lead the way towards the West and towards the collaboration with other countries, not only with the West, with the Arab states as well. Something that he mentioned also in the campaign, that he's interested in continuing the trend that Raisi started. And of course, I think this will be part of the debate, so I will not mention that. But the fact that Haniyeh was killed in Tehran the same day that he was inaugurating his term marked his I would say, the beginning of his term in office, because he had to go out and make some declarations, of course, against Israel. And he has the very big challenge to participate in the decision, if he can, on what Iran has to do or will do in retaliation of what happened for the execution of Haniyeh. So I will leave it there. And then, of course, we can keep discussing. I would love to hear my colleagues, and then start the debate on whatever you want.
Thank you, Luciano, for providing a comprehensive rundown of the election results and also providing us with further food for thought, especially, I think, whether or not the new president can produce change within the system. And this is also something we would like to ask our second speaker, Professor Mehran Kamrava, whom I'm about to introduce very shortly. He is, of course, not a new face to us. We recently hosted him for a book talk on his latest monograph, Righteous Politics, Power and Resilience in Iran. Professor Mehran Kamrava is a professor of government at Georgetown University, Qatar, and he also directs the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. He's a prolific author and he has many book titles to his name. I just named one earlier, and his other recent books include a dynastic history of Iran from the Qajars to the Pahlavis, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. And among other books, he has also written on topics such as Palestine, Qatari politics, and water insecurity in the Gulf. So it's good to have you with us today, Mehran, and we'd like to hear your thoughts on the cabinet appointments, their significance, and most importantly, as we discussed and heard from Luciano earlier, the amount of political space that could be accorded to President Pezeshkian to maneuver, whether it is domestically or in foreign policy. So over to you, Mehran.
Thank you very much, Clemens. Let me begin by thanking you and the rest of the team at the Middle East Institute for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be here. As you mentioned, this is not my first collaboration with MEI, and it's always been a source of pride and an honor for me. And it's particularly gratifying to be on the same panel with Dr. Yazdan Shenas and my friend Luciano Zaccara. In many ways, we can say that Pezeshkian's cabinet selection was the first political debacle that he had to deal with, because he asked the political old-timer, Iran's former chief diplomat, Mohammad Javad Zarif, to become his vice president for strategic affairs, which in simple terms, in many ways, as Zarif himself later said, meant that he was the national security advisor, if you will. And Zarif put together a series of criteria for selecting cabinet ministers. He put together a committee, an ad hoc committee that he was supervising, managing, and they came out with a number of criteria for selecting cabinet ministers, at least two Sunni cabinet ministers, two individuals from Iran's Sunni community, a number of people from ethnic communities, at least two women, people who haven't served in official positions before. And there was a lot of buzz and anticipation that what we would see is not just new faces, but a new politic in Iran, the beginning of meritocracy, the beginning or a return to meritocracy, emphasis on professionalism, emphasis on diversity, and there was a lot of excitement, particularly among people who had voted for Pezeshkian, and there was this assumption and anticipation that this would be a new start for Iran. Well, it turned out that when Pezeshkian introduced his cabinet, there was only one woman. There were no members from Iran's Sunni community. It was not a diverse cabinet. It was not necessarily a young cabinet. It was a cabinet where many of the members had either formerly served as cabinet ministers or as deputy ministers. So it wasn't as much of a radical departure from politics as usual. And Zarif, as a result, resigned. Now, I'll talk a little bit about Zarif's resignation. But before I do, let me just mention that by all indications, it was the office of the leader that had kind of either approved or suggested a list of candidates to Pezeshkian, or had not necessarily endorsed many of Pezeshkian's first choices. In fact, later on, Zarif came out with a whole list of people and said, look, some of the people who are being recommended or have been nominated to be cabinet ministers were number 5 or 6 in terms of they were the 5th or 6th choice of this committee that he had put together. So interestingly, as you mentioned, Clemens, the cabinet was just approved by Iranian parliament, the Majlis. There was some robust debate within the Majlis about the credentials and qualifications of some of these candidates. One of the Sunni members of the Majlis gave a very passionate speech in which he said, of all the millions of Iranian Sunnis, does this mean there was not a single one who was qualified enough to run any of the ministries? There was a lot of debate about the fact that women have such scant representation in the parliament. Only one woman, who's now the Minister of Municipalities and Urban Affairs. And by the way, there had only been one female member of cabinet in the past during Ahmadinejad's presidency, Minister of Health, who was at some point called before the parliament and forced to resign after a vote of no confidence. So, women have been systematically, in many ways, either excluded or marginalized from the political process, and they, by and large, continue to be during the Pezeshkian administration. There was a lot of debate as to, and there's been a lot of second guessing as to precisely why Zarif resigned. Some people say he resigned because of the law, new law that says people who are either married or who have relatives that have dual nationality cannot have official positions. Zarif's sons were born in the United States when he was a student and when he was a diplomat stationed in the US. And so some people are speculating that that's the reason. And he himself came out and said in a number of social media posts that he resigned not out of disagreements with Pezeshkian, but because he felt he was not good enough for the position, which is really kind of more of a political statement rather than an actual reflection of the fact. He has been promoting and congratulating Pezeshkian on the endorsement by the Majlis. Every one of the cabinet ministers was approved by the Majlis, which is in itself an indication of the compliance of the Majlis with the wishes of the supreme leader, given that apparently, by all indications, cabinet members were vetted before by and approved by the so-called leadership office, the office of the leader. One notable cabinet member is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Abbas Araghchi, who was Zarif's deputy and who was in charge of negotiations in 2015. And Araghchi's appointment has increased a lot of hope and anticipation that Iran would be willing to negotiate. Let's remember that it was not Iran that withdrew out of the nuclear accord. It was the United States that unilaterally withdrew under the Trump administration, and it was the United States under the Biden administration that did not re-enter, although in his campaign promises Joe Biden had said the United States would revive the nuclear accord. And let's remember also that it was the European Union that did not have the courage to withstand American pressure, to stand up to the Americans. They haven't had the backbone to abide by the terms of the nuclear accord, 2015 nuclear accord. And so they've been kowtowing to the Americans, and as a result, the nuclear accord has been morbid. I say this is really important to remember, because everybody says, well, is Iran willing to negotiate? Well, the real question is the West, the European Union, the Americans, do they have the political courage to go back to negotiating with Iran? And I think that's the real question here. It's not the Iranians who pulled out of the nuclear accord. It was the Americans, both under Biden, under Trump, and then later under Biden. And it was not Iran that let the nuclear accord die. In fact, for a year after 2015, the Iranians continued to abide by the terms of the agreement, even though the Americans had pulled out. But it was the European Union that didn't have the political courage to stand up to the Americans. And I think we need to be realistic. We need to be fair and judicious in looking at the strategic landscape and the political landscape. Doesn't mean the Iranians are innocent, doesn't mean they're not guilty of a whole variety of things. In fact, the Iranian political system tends to be its own worst enemy. It specializes in scoring own goals. But at least in terms of the nuclear accord, it was not the Iranians who pulled out of it. And I think that's very important. Finally, I think I just want to end with a quick point about the overall significance of Pezeshkian's election. It could very well be that this is yet another disappointment, just as Khatami's 2 terms turned out to be disappointment. It could very well be that just as in his second term, Rouhani didn't do much or was prevented from doing much, Pezeshkian's term could turn out to be similar. Already, Pezeshkian has been quite silent when there was this video that was made public of the morality police beating up 2 young girls and dragging them into their into a van. Pezeshkian, who was quite articulate, who was kind of acted and talked like a tough guy, he was absolutely silent, didn't say anything about the excesses of the morality police. And it could very well be that his cabinet, which he calls Cabinet of National Reconciliation, could be more of the same and not all that important. Having said all of this, it could very well turn out that Pezeshkian's presidency turns out to be unintentionally quite significant. All of us, unfortunately, die, even if we are supreme leaders. And the Iranian supreme leader is 84 years old. And for more than a decade now, the political system has been gearing up for succession. And that succession might occur at any moment, given the fact that the supreme leader is 84 years old. And in that sense, if Pezeshkian's presidency is the presidency during which a succession of the highest office of the Islamic Republic occurs, that could turn out to be quite significant in terms of the institution of the presidency and the role of the sitting president. So it could very well turn out that Pezeshkian's presidency is far more significant in terms of the history of the Islamic Republic than at first meets the eye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mehran. I think you touched on various issues and ended on a very high note on the succession issue, which we'll come back to during the Q&A, I'm very sure. And you also mentioned something that you also wrote in your book, that the Iranian regime is its own and own worst enemy. And we'll come back again to that because you touch on many points that I think deserve further elaboration. But now we want to turn to foreign policy and then go a bit further on the foreign policy landscape. And we'd like to turn to our third speaker, Dr. Zakiye Yazdashinas. And let me introduce her. Dr. Zakiye Yazdashinas is an assistant professor of global studies at the University of Tehran. She is also a senior research fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies, where she directs the China-MENA project at the center. Her last book is titled The Pivot of US-Asian Strategy and the Containment of China. Her writing has focused on Iran's regional policy, having published pieces in journals, in foreign policy, in the national interest, in the Atlantic Council, among others. So her comments today, we'd like to hear, will revolve around Tehran's foreign policy and, of course, on China and Russia, where we expect some continuity, but I would like to hear from our speaker whether there are nuances in this continuity or strengthening, if there's any. So we also like to know whether the perceptions of Iran will change and the regional dynamics will change with Pezeshkian at the helm. So the floor is yours, Zakiye. Over to you.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you, Clemens, and also the Middle East Institute for having me. It's a pleasure to be here once again, especially alongside Dr. Kamrabo and Dr. Zakara. If I want to answer the main question of today's panel, and to cut a long story short, I go for maintaining the status quo rather than shifting the tides and great and important changes. And this is particularly true when it comes to foreign policy and international relations of the Islamic Republic of Iran. As we all know, Iran has a hybrid political system consisting of both elected and unelected institutions. And in most foreign policy issues, I should say that the latter have the upper hand. As the Supreme Leader emphasized after an audio recording of Zarif's interview leaked in 2021, foreign policy decision-making in Iranian system is outside the remit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it is actually the duty of higher levels of authority. And by higher levels, I mean the Supreme National Security Council, the IRGC, and of course, the Supreme Leader himself. However, the administration and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can play a role in decision shaping, in foreign policy decision shaping. From the pre-election televised debates and to all official speeches, including those in front of the parliament, Pezeshkian truly demonstrates that he comprehends and he validates the ever-widening gap between the government and the society in contemporary era. And contrary to many other officials, he has talked about public resentment on different occasions and called for fundamental changes in the previous way of governance to remedy the inefficiencies, including those related to foreign policy. Considering the hybrid nature of the Iranian political system, it seems that the new president's plan for increasing the administration's impact and the administration's agency on foreign policy decision shaping is primarily based on two factors. First, avoiding the presentation of a specific governance scheme and instead adhering to the general policies defined by the Supreme Leader. And second, introducing what he calls the government of national unity, or a government of national reconciliation, as Dr. Kamrabo defined it, by inviting politicians from various political factions to participate in the administration. In other words, Pezeshkian is attempting to encourage them to have a skin in the game, to reduce internal obstacles, to make changes in various areas, including relations with the West, of course, and addressing the nuclear issue. But I believe the new administration represents and portrays mainly a form of political compromise rather than truly national unity. Considering this background, the foreign policy priority of the new administration, of course, will be to continue the good neighborhood policy that was introduced by the previous administration, the administration of Raisi. During the inauguration ceremony, the Supreme Leader also indicated that in the realm of diplomacy, relations with neighboring countries should take priority. Arabchi, the newly appointed Foreign Affairs Minister, also emphasized the importance of improving bilateral relations with neighboring countries. I believe that while the previous administration invested in neighborhood policy as an alternative to alleviate the sanction-hit economy, the new administration's foreign policy team will prioritize the desecuritization of Iran in the eyes of Arab nations. And I'm basing this belief based on the discourse regularly repeated by foreign policy figures and foreign policy circles that are close to the new president. Apart from diplomatic relations, Iran's regional policy is an integral part of its security doctrine, and it implies that its formulation and its implementation are outside the executive branch's remit and are mainly the responsibility of the IRGC Quds Force, of course. Therefore, Iran's support for its network of regional allies and partners known as the Axis of Resistance is unlikely to change during Pezeshkian's presidency. But Pezeshkian's ability to balance regional policy and regional strategy, or borrowing Zarif's words, field versus diplomacy, depends on his capacity to coordinate among the various institutions involved in decision-making, including the Supreme National Security Council, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and the IRGC, and of course, to gain the Supreme Leader's trust. For now, we should all wait to see if his approach, which is introducing the National Unity Administration, works or not. Regarding the priorities of the US and European countries concerning Iran's foreign policy, their primary focus remains Iran's nuclear program, I think. The regional and global circumstances, but the regional and global circumstances are now significantly different compared to 2015 when the JCPOA was signed for the first time, and even in 2021 when Rouhani's administration was very close to reviving the agreement, the JCPOA. In 2015, to address Iran's nuclear program, President Obama could actually decouple Iran's nuclear program from Iran's missile program and regional policy. But in the current regional atmosphere, the nuclear program and regional policy, Iran's nuclear program and its regional policy, are more intertwined than at any other time. This, of course, does not necessarily mean that Tehran intends to weaponize its nuclear program, but it implies that maintaining the ability to enrich uranium to over 60% and keeping the current stockpile of enriched uranium are of great importance for Iran. These capabilities can serve as part of Iran's deterrence strategy rather than merely as bargaining chips, as various officials, including Kamal Kharazmi, have stated that if Iran is threatened, if Iran feels to be threatened seriously, it has no choice but to change its nuclear doctrine. Overall, the negotiations over a nuclear agreement are the results of the interaction of several factors, including the power distribution in the United States, as Dr. Kamrabah mentioned, the power distribution in Iran, Iran's nuclear capability at the current stage, Iran's position in the region, and the turbulent situation of the region that can act like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can increase US motivation for a nuclear deal to control tensions in the region, and on the other hand, it can enhance Israel and its lobbies' influence to pressure Washington to avoid an agreement with Iran. In general, I believe that a reformist administration in Iran makes only one positive component in this complex matrix, but the overall situation is too complicated for reviving the JCPOA or reaching an alternative agreement, at least in the short term. Another important issue of Iran's foreign policy is its long-term strategic relationship with China and, of course, with Russia, which mainly are referred to as look to the East policy. The Supreme Leader advised the new administration to expand relations with countries that did not reduce their ties with Iran during the sanctions. And here he clearly referred to China and Russia. However, in my opinion, the executive branch has relatively more agency and more subjectivity in regulating look to the East policy compared to other foreign policy issues of the country. But in analyzing look to the East policy, we should differentiate between Iran-China relations and Russia-Iran relations in terms of scale and scope of these relationships. Although Iran and China signed the Joint Comprehensive Strategic Agreement in 2021, their bilateral relations have not yet been institutionalized and developed in all dimensions. The bilateral relations between Iran and China are mainly focused in the commercial field. And in my opinion, this trend, of course, will continue in the Pezeshkian administration. Currently, China is the most important importer of Iranian oil. The new administration, I think the new administration will uphold the comprehensive strategic agreement, but maybe with limitations to prevent escalating tensions with the West. Regarding relations with Russia, I should mention that these relations are more solid and more deep. And in addition to commercial and economic dimensions, they have security and military dimensions too. And it means that there are other important stakeholders in regulating relations with Moscow. Therefore, ongoing military technical collaborations outside the executive branch's purview persist, I believe, but advancements in political and economic ties, particularly those with strategic implications, may decelerate. In general, the new administration aspires to pursue a balanced approach, echoing Zarif's word. And this approach entails steering away from traditional alliance models and instead advocating for nuanced relationships with major powers, positioning Iran at the nexus of a triangle encompassing Russia, Iran, and of course, European powers. While Pezeshkian articulates aspirations for a diversified foreign policy akin to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, I think that Iran's political system, historical tensions with Western powers, internal power dynamics, and the current regional situation pose significant challenges to realizing such ambitions. And that's all I vote for maintaining the status quo for now.
Thank you, Dr. Zakia Yazdashinas, for sharing with us her thoughts on Iran's foreign policy. And I think we'll come back to that perhaps because we wanted to take her view and share with the rest of the panel and see what they also have to say in response to your thinking that that the status quo will be the direction that Iran will be going. But we've come to the Q&A segment, and I'd like to let our audience know that if you have questions, again, you can put them in the chat box and they can be addressed rerouted to the speakers. And I want to start, with a pretty broad question, because I know, Zakia, you mentioned about the status quo, but both Mehran and Luciano, you talked about the possibility of minor changes, but perhaps I could put it this way. If there are going to be minor changes, which sectors or which areas would you likely see them under a Pezeshkian presidency? Maybe we'll start with that. Perhaps we'll turn back around to Luciano, because I think he covered a lot on election results, and maybe there's more to say in terms of what public sentiment was expressing during the campaigning process. So Luciano, over to you.
Okay. Well, again, as Mehran mentioned, there was the expectation, or at least Zarif was planning to have a very representative cabinet. That there was expectation that Pezeshkian would have a cabinet representing the majority of the different groups that exist in Iran. This was the expectation of Zarif as well. And we see that this is not happening. At the end of the day, he had a cabinet that was easily approved by the Majlis. I mean, otherwise it would have been complicated, considering that the Majlis is controlled by the conservatives right now. So maybe it was much more pragmatic a decision to include a mixed cabinet, but including many from the conservative camp to avoid rejections from the Majlis. This will mean that probably things that had to do with internal politics will not change that much. I think that in the main area in which we can expect changes in foreign policy, but not drastic changes compared with what happened during Raisi's time. And we have to remember that also that the second term and last years of Rouhani were not as it was expected from the West in terms of a dialogue, in terms of cooperation, because of the failure of the JCPOA, because of Trump's pulling out from the JCPOA, which forced Iran to have stronger approaches to foreign policy, pushing or pressuring the rest of the international community by withdrawing gradually from the JCPOA as well. But what I expect is Araghchi will try to open that door again of the negotiations, nuclear negotiations, maybe with the support of the European Union and the support of the GCC states, considering now that during the times of the last period of Rouhani and during the times of Raisi, there was a normalization with Saudi Arabia and Emirates that so far is not under danger. So if Iran keeps this policy of a priority given to the GCC states, with the addition of the new impulse to the dialogue with the West and to resume negotiations on the nuclear file, I think this is where we can see some change. Why? Because this can bring other changes in the economic level. I mean, one of the most problematic issues of Iran is the situation of the economy, inflation, unemployment, lack of investment from the West. So this did not change, neither after the JCPOA nor during Raisi's time. So I think that this is the biggest challenge, to have a policy, foreign policy, that would allow or we encourage investments both from the Iranian community abroad and from foreign companies to go to Iran again.
Thanks, Luciano. I think since we've tried to bridge that domestic/foreign policy gap at the minute, maybe I'll ask Mehran to do the same. But I'd like to ask more specifically, because Mehran, in your book, you talked about how the institutional innovation of elections actually allows for co-optation of political opponents. And are you seeing this in such a case, in such a scenario where Pezeshkian obviously was given the blessing to run, and then of course he came out tops? Or is this a sign of relative moderation from Ayatollah Khamenei himself? Or is it also, could it reflect a new balance of power between conservatives and reformists? I think Luciano touched on that during his opening remarks, but I'd like to hear from you on this.
I think it's a little of each. It's a little of all, if you would. On the one hand, the political system from 2021 had gone to the right. And the impulse for it had been to kind of go back in some ways, not necessarily go for the pendulum to swing towards the reformists, but the conservatism of Raisi and company was untenable. And so in many ways, you've got to remember that this is ultimately, as ideological as the political system is, it's also pragmatic and practical. And it was due for some course correction. And that course correction came out earlier than anticipated in the form of an unanticipated election and kind of throwing up of Pezeshkian. Now, being more specific, given all the controversy and all the displeasure that has been voiced about the composition of the cabinet, Pezeshkian has himself come out and said, don't judge them by their names, judge them by their actions. And so I think the jury is still out on that. Is this, and in many ways, I think he's right. We have to wait and see how this cabinet performs. It really hasn't had any time in office, and it could very well be that the cabinet delivers on some of the president's own promises or the promises that are attributed to him. And one last word, Clemens, that I think is quite important to remember. Whether or not they say it, presidents in Iran and elsewhere usually are judged by their work in office during their first 100 days. Certainly, Rouhani came out and said, this is what I'm going to do in the first 100 days. And so Pezeshkian is going to be judged in the first 100 days in terms of one of three key pressing issues that are important for the average Iranian person. First and foremost, the speed of the internet, filtering. Is he going to be able to remove filtering? Second, is he going to be able to make overtures to the West, to the European Union, and to the Americans concerning negotiations, or at least change a different posture, as Professor Yazdan Shenas mentioned? Are they going to desecuritize Iran in the eyes of the world? And third, is he going to be able to get rid of the morality police, or at least rein them in? And any one of these issues, these are three key issues that the Iranian public has to deal with on a daily basis and grapple with on a very tangible, real level. And so I think he will be judged on one or more of these three pressing issues.
Thanks, Mehran. I think a lot of food for thought there. Like you said, your last bits of your comments, speed of the internet filtering, overtures towards the West, and of course the morality police. Do the other two panelists want to respond to that in terms of these three pressing issues, or add to those priorities? We do have questions flowing in already, just for your info. But let me take Mehran's comments, one part of Mehran's comments up, which is the overtures to the West, and redirect it to Zakir, because you talked about securitization earlier, and Mehran also touched on this point about whether there is a possibility of overtures to the West. We do have one question coming in from Michael Backfish, and also, I mean, this comment is directed to you, Zakir, and the question is, if Iran feels threatened, could it change its nuclear doctrine, and what would that mean in the current highly tense political situation in the Middle East? And this also, if other panelists have something to add, you feel free after Zakir, please.
Okay. As we all have heard, the officials of the administration, Pezeshkian administration, and also the officials of the former administration of Raisi always refuse to comment regarding any changes or any possible changes in the Iranian nuclear doctrine. Just yesterday, Khatibzadeh, the speaker of the administration, clearly stated that the administration and the Islamic Republic is not going to change its nuclear doctrine. But it is something that the current officials are saying. We have occasionally said different comments from previous officials like Dr. Kamal Kharazi, that Iran may change its nuclear doctrine if it has to. What I think is that Iran is not going to acquire nuclear bomb, is not going to weaponize its nuclear program, at least now, but it prefers to stay the status of being a latent nuclear power. And it means that maintaining the ability to enrich uranium over 60% and maintain the current stockpile of enriched uranium it currently has, which I think it is something about 120 kilogram of 60% enriched uranium. And in these circumstances, I think that Iran needs such capabilities to secure its territory, to guarantee its security, while at the same time, it is not a nuclear power, it is not out of the nuclear treaty, and in this situation, Iran actually is playing a win-win game, I think, by such a doctrine.
Thank you. Thank you. Do the other two panelists have anything to add on this?
If I may, I completely agree with everything Dr. Yazdan Shanas just mentioned. I think the one thing that's also important to remember is the shift in public sentiment. From a policy perspective, nuclear ambiguity or kind of this latent breakthrough capacity makes perfect sense. But, an increasing number of Iranians now, an increasing number of them are saying, look, Iran abided by the terms of the 2015 agreement. And the sanctions weren't removed. Sanctions were imposed. So no matter what Iran does, the West is going to find, or the Americans at least, are going to find excuses to keep the sanctions in place. And so Iran doesn't have a bargaining chip in many ways. The only bargaining chip it has is increased levels of enrichment and probably kind of the threat or the talk of actually getting a nuclear device. So I think, public sentiment is also something to keep in mind.
Thank you. Luciano, please.
Yeah, just to confirm what Mehran was saying about public opinion. I mean, public opinion has been changing a lot since 2016 until now in terms of how Iranians increasingly are supporting having a nuclear program as the way to defend Iran, considering what happened until now. But I think what we have to wait a few months because there will be elections in the US. And it's not the same if Kamala Harris and Trump wins. I mean, everybody remember what happened with Trump. And we know that negotiating with Trump for Arakchi would be much more complicated than starting or opening a door of negotiation with Harris. This is my guess. It might be totally wrong because with Biden, we were expecting something and nothing happened. But
there you
could I say something?
Yes.
I actually tend to disagree with Luciano on that. I think the problem with Trump is he thinks he's the smartest person. And what Trump is after is a picture. Remember that he invited Iranian foreign minister to the White House. He's the only president, American president, to have walked on North Korean soil, all for the sake of publicity and for a picture. And so if the Iranians are clever enough to play into his vanity and play into his desire for grandioseness, then I think it would be much easier to deal with a buffoon like Trump than with an ideologically committed individual like Kamala Harris or what we have seen with Biden.
Thanks, Mehran. Zakir, would you like to touch on that since we've gotten the segue into the next component, which is the U.S. administration, and of course, the potential change that might be happening in the White House in November. Zakir, over to you if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I totally agree with Dr. Kamrava. And honestly, I'm going to add a comment regarding the situation. We might have a Harris in the White House. Referring to the matrix that I was explaining and I was defining, I think that by Harris in the White House, we may face two positive components in the matrix, but still there are still many complexities to reach a deal because when in 2020 Biden was running for the election, we all expected returning to the JCPOA as soon as possible as the first foreign policy priority of the United States. But after almost 4 years, nothing has happened. And so I think we might not witness something new with Harris, and just imagine what would happen if Trump is in the White House. Things will get much complicated, and if I think that Islamic Republic of Iran has made itself ready enough for the scenario in which Trump would win the election, and in such a scenario, reaching an agreement, I think, is off the limit completely.
Thank you, Zaki. I'd like to turn to from the US, because now there are several questions from the audience regarding regional relations and, of course, the immediate regional situation that we are seeing in the Middle East. And I think we have, from different people in the audience, the gist of it, and I'd like to group the questions together. The gist of it is really, would Iran be forced into entering the conflict with Israel? Or would Iran be facing increasing pressure to enter the regional conflict? And a second part to this question is that, will Iran be likely to maintain its status quo with its neighboring states with its axis of resistance still present? So 2 parts to that question. Maybe would Luciano want to take it up first?
Okay. Well, Israel keeps pressing Iran to enter into that more direct confrontation. What happened before in April that got the retaliation from Iran, 300 missiles and drones. We all expected that this would keep the situation calm between Iran and Israel for a while. And what happened lately with the killing of one commander of Hezbollah and the killing of Haniyeh in Tehran shows that Israel will be pushing the limits to see to what extent Iran is able to retaliate or to enter or engage in a direct confrontation, because this is the way to deviate the attention and to get support from the US, either from Biden, Harris, or Trump. So how Iran will react or is replying or will reply to the next provocations, I mean, I think that the Iranians, they don't want to enter into a war. Neither Raisi wanted, nor Pezeshkian wanted. Nobody considered that entering in a direct war would be beneficial for Iran. And again, as Mehran said, public opinion is also important in this case, because majority of Iranians don't want to engage into that. On the other hand, keeping the status quo that was initiated with the signature of these 2 normalizations, mainly the Saudi one, proved that it was useful, at least to reduce the tension between the 2 shores of the Gulf. And there is no, how do you say, complications for Iran in keeping the axis of resistance with the support of Iran to Hezbollah, Hamas, and relation with Syria and the militias in Iraq, and the relations that they recently were established with the 2 GCC states. So these 2 trends in Iranian foreign policy are going at the same time, because one is helping to support Hamas, which is a cause that nobody can combat or fight against in the other side of the Gulf. So I think Iran will not have many issues at the regional level, only with Israel, of course. And if Iran managed to keep this level of low confrontation without being dragged in a bigger fight, supposedly they will not have bigger problems or bigger challenges, I would say, at the foreign policy level.
Thanks, Chano. Mehran, over to you if you have something to add.
Yeah, Professor Yazdan Shanas mentioned the look-east policy. which became official. It had been in place, but it became official during the Raisi presidency, and Pezeshkian has already said he's going to maintain it. He has also gone out of his way to say that he will maintain Iran's good neighborly policy, another policy which is left over from the Raisi administration. And so, the days of tension between Iran and the UAE, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran and Azerbaijan, and even Iran and Afghanistan appear to be behind us. Those days ended in early 2021. And so we see that culminating in the March 2023 rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So I anticipate that Iran's good neighborly policy will continue. I also anticipate that Iran will continue its close relationship with the so-called axis of resistance, because the axis of resistance, more than anything else, serves as a deterrent against Israel for Iran. Remember that Iran views Iraq, Syria, Lebanon as part of what is the Iranian establishment calls its strategic depth. And so that strategic depth, they cannot afford to dispense with it and to kind of loosen relations with either Hezbollah or the Houthis or militias in Iraq, which of course act relatively autonomously, but maintain close coordination with Iran anyway.
Thank you, Mehran. Zakiya, over to you.
Okay. In terms of regional policy, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that we will witness maintaining the status quo during the presidency of the new president Pezeshkian, and even we may witness reviving the ties, diplomatic ties between Iran and Bahrain, and also between Iran and Egypt, as some initiatives has started during the former administration to revive these diplomatic ties. And regarding your question about the possible dragging of Iran into a regional war, I believe that Iran does not need to enter such a war, contrary to Israel, that desperately needs such a war to distract public opinion from the current genocide in Gaza, and as well as its failure to accomplish all its reiterated aims over the past 11 months. Iran's regional doctrine after October 7 attacks has not actually suffered much. Iran has even found the opportunity to showcase that it has the power and it has the will to reach Israel's territory if it chooses, as demonstrated this by Operation True Promise. But I believe that regarding Ismail Haniyeh's assassination in Iran, I believe that Iran reserves the right for itself to retaliate for the assassination, but it might avoid tit-for-tat actions in the short term, and instead it may try to define a new level of deterrence and invest on a new level of deterrence that might encompass new elements. Might actually add new elements to its current regional deterrence.
Thank you, Zakiya. And I think we've heard, I think two main things that I can single out is that one is that the enrichment of uranium serves as a bargaining chip for Iran, and then the axis of resistance serves as a deterrent for Iran. But I want to come back to something that Mehran said earlier about the overtures towards the West, the possibility of it. And because there was discussion on Gaza, and we know that, prior to October 7, there was talk about sanctions relief, about 6 million worth in frozen uranium assets was supposedly due to be released as part of sanctions relief and economic relief, but was then put on ice after that when October 7 happened. So if we were to tie in this with the overtures to the West, what is the possibility of warming relations up the West and to the West, not just to the United States, but also to Europe? And also, would that provide some kind of economic relief to Iran? I think we'll turn back to Luciano.
I wish I could reply that question, and I don't know. Again, Araghchi, I mean, the appointment of Araghchi means something, means that the continuation of the dialogue is an objective of Pezeshkian. How this will be received in Europe, considering that Europe is also against what Iran is doing in Gaza, or how Iran is involved in this, will be very complicated. I think that it would be very difficult to see any progress in Iran's relation with the West as far as the Gaza conflict, Gaza war continues. I think this is something that was unexpected and almost derailed the different positive trends that were going on in the region that were reducing the tension. Iran so far benefited from that, but the long term, it cannot be continued. The permanent confrontation between Iran and Israel will not attract, whoever is the president in Iran will not attract the support from Europe, neither it will facilitate any direct conversation with the United States. I mean, at this point, the United States is trying not to engage in a direct war with Iran in retaliation for what they did in Israel, so it's very difficult that they would negotiate directly. We all remember that a few months ago, I mean, before the October 7, Raisi recognized that there were direct conversation with the United States, but I don't think they continue anymore. So I think that unfortunately, until the Gaza war is ended and how it's ended and how this affects Iran behavior at the regional level will determine absolutely how the future of the negotiation between, or the dialogue between Iran and the West will go. When this war will finish, I mean, this is the big question that nobody can reply. So far, all the efforts failed, but I don't think Iran is guilty of what is going on in this case. I mean, Iran is just reacting and pushing or continuing the same policy that have been applying since the beginning of the implementation of the Islamic Republic regarding the Palestine issue. They are being consistent in the support of Hamas and Hezbollah in their axis of resistance, and this consistency is what benefited Iran since the beginning of the war and attracted much more support even from the Arab world towards the way in which Iran is acting or reacting in the war. This is more or less what I can say, but I mean, it's difficult to predict in this case.
Thanks, Luciano. Mihran?
Clemens, I think you raise a very important point when you talk about the release of Iranian funds in South Korea. So what this tells us is that there are different ways in which Iran and the US or Iran and the European Union can demonstrate their goodwill toward each other. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be negotiating over enrichment or kind of lifting of all the sanctions. There are a number of issues, some much more central to the animosity between these and some rather marginal, that can be worked on. There are low-hanging fruits. For example, much of the Iranian money that's tied up elsewhere, not just in South Korea. There is various kinds of sanctions waiver related to specific issues, sale of Iranian electricity to Iraq, export of fruits and vegetables to Qatar. Those kinds of things that are issue specific, that show goodwill towards one another. And so if there is a beginning of reciprocity and kind of a goodwill tit for tat, then I think that's a interesting beginning. And there's a new administration in Iran which has expressed willingness and desire to kind of turn over a new leaf in its relations with the US and the European Union. And we'll have to wait and see, as we just heard, will there be the same kind of determination and goodwill coming out of Washington after January, the inauguration of a new administration in the US in January of 2025.
Thank you, Mehran. I think the term was, or the phrase used by the new foreign minister was management of hostility, if I were correct. But Zakia, do you want to have anything to add to this?
Okay. I just would like to refer to the remarks by the Supreme Leader during the inauguration ceremony of Pezeshkian. He said that Iran is ready to prioritize relations with Western powers, with European powers, of course, he mentioned, if they promised to leave hostilities behind. And I think that Iran is already showing green light. Actually, Araghchi, in his speech in front of the parliament, repeated the same sentences, that Iran is ready to expand its relations, expand its ties with European countries if they pass all the hostilities, and if they show that they are willing to actually solve the problems. So I think that the responsibility now in this current situation is on European countries. And for the start, maybe they can stop all the attempts, all the initiatives to put IRGC under the list of organizations related to terrorism.
Thank you, Zaki. I think I would have to come back to you again, because I'm looking at the questions that come in and I'm trying to group them in a way that we will maximize our remaining 8 minutes together. We have questions on China, and we have questions on succession. So let me group the questions on China for Zakier. Of course, we know that there is a CSP signed with China, the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement. And the questions in general are about whether there has been deepening of relations since that CSP was signed. One of the questions asks whether there has been successful cultural diplomacy due to the number of Iranian Studies Center in China. Another question asks about investments, whether there has been flows of investments, and I think Iranian officials have been saying that this is insufficient. And the third one is about a change in US administration. How would that change the dynamics in the relations with China? So it's a bit threefold, but I will let Zakier tackle these three. On succession, and I put this out to Lishano and Mehran. On succession, the questions are really in general, because Mehran, earlier you talked about there might be this presidency might well be a very significant one if the succession were to take place under Pezeshkian. The question really is about, what kind of succession will we be expected to see should that take place under this presidency? So I think I'll put it as simple as that, but I'll start with Zakier on the China questions, please.
Okay. As I mentioned, I believe that the new administrations would, of course, uphold the comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with China. As the Supreme Leader mentioned during his remarks in the inauguration ceremony, the administration is obliged to expand ties with China and Russia, and as these two countries are among the great powers in the global arena that continue their ties with Iran during the sanctions that were imposed on Iran. But I believe that expanding relations with China is a long-term objective for Iran and, of course, for the administration too. For now, the bilateral relations are mainly limited to the commercial and economic dimensions, and other dimensions like military cooperation or even cooperation in fields like education, cultural cooperations are not expanded yet. But of course, it does not mean that the previous administration or the current administration are not going to expand them. But I believe that the proper institutions that are going to be organized, that are going to cooperate with each other in order to facilitate these ties, still are not coordinated yet. And maybe Pezeshkian administration, if it involves in range of negotiations with Western powers to gain some sort of sanction relief, maybe the new administration stop expanding ties with China as fast as the previous administration was going to, just to remove the obstacles in front of the probable negotiations. But at the end, I believe that this is part of the grand strategy of the Islamic Republic, and the new administration does not have the ability, does not have the responsibility to remove this part of important pillar of grand strategy of Iran, and it has to obey all the main pillars that are defined by the supreme leader and of course the Supreme Supreme National Security Council.
Thank you, Zakir. And we have 3 minutes, and I think Zakir's last part on the Supreme leader's hold on Iranian politics, I think is our way to end the discussion and wrap up the discussion for today. So we had questions of succession, and Mehran, you talked about in your opening remarks that this could well be an interesting episode if the succession takes place under the Pezeshkian presidency. So, and Luciano, you talked about the legacy as well of the past presidents, the style and the leadership style. So what can we expect in terms of succession if it were to take place under Pezeshkian?
Well, another good and difficult question. We have been listening since 2006 when the Assembly of Experts was elected, that this would be or could be the Assembly of Experts that had to choose the next leader. The same happened in 2016, and the same happened in 2024 in the legislative election when again the Assembly of Experts was renewed. And all the names we have been listening since 2006 about possible candidates to succeed Khamenei, they are already dead, including Raisi, which was the last bet that most of the people coincided that he would be the next one. With this current situation, and considering that there's now again cohabitation between the reformist president and conservative other institutions, I believe if this was the case, that they need to replace Khamenei, they might go for this council of leadership rather than selecting one single leader. This is something that is mentioned in the constitution, that could be, if someone cannot comply with all the requirements, could be 3 or even 5 council of leadership until we find some. Nowadays, I don't think there is nobody that could match with the political and religious requirements of that position. I don't think the other name that has been going around is Moshtaba, the son of Khamenei, but I really don't think that the political elite now would go for that.
Thank you, Luciano. Mehran, you have the last and final word.
Very quickly, expect to be surprised. Khamenei's ascension to the position was a surprise that no one anticipated. He didn't have the right credentials, but he was anointed for that position anyway. And I think there are individuals that might, for the sake of continuity, that would be installed in the position or selected for the position. And so I think we should just anticipate to be surprised. This is a remarkably resilient and resourceful system, and I'm sure they'll think of some sort of a solution.
Thank you, Mehran. So we've come to the end of today's enriching discussion. I'd like to thank all our panelists, Dr. Zakir Yasdashinas, Dr. Luciano Zakara, and Professor Mehran Kamrava for joining us today to discuss Iran's new presidency. I think there was a lot to take home, and we touched on both domestic politics and foreign policy. And so thank you to all three of you, and also thank you to our team for setting this up and the audience for putting in your questions. So we hope to see you again on another of MEI's events. Thank you, everyone.